Good evening, Tanse, and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. In Saskatchewan, it's been a year of big news stories, from the search for Frank Young to the mass stabbing on the James Smith Cree Nation. The world focused on Saskatchewan during international news coverage. Leanne Sanders brings us Saskatchewan's year in review.
Saskatchewan had its share of stories of grief and trauma in 2022. In February, 54 potential unmarked graves were found on the Kisikoos First Nation in eastern Saskatchewan with the help of ground-penetrating radar. Ted Cusons is a survivor and former chief. He says the findings back up what survivors in the community have always said about unmarked graves.
Our chief has recognized that healing is not a political event. The work that has been done within our community, it's not politics. It's a human issue.
In April, the search for 5-year-old Frank Young of the Red Earth Cree Nation started. He went missing on April 19th. He was found deceased in July, not far from where he was last seen. Later on in July, Dawn Walker, an author and longtime senior employee of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations, went missing from Saskatoon with her son. FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron pleaded for help.
With her communication skills, her personality and her attitude, as always, it was a daily thing to hear from her or to give her a call. So everyone knew something was wrong when we didn't hear from her.
After 15 days, Walker and her son were found in Oregon, and she was charged in Canada and the U.S. with multiple offenses, from parental abduction to forging a passport to get into the States. Those cases are still before the courts. In early September, tragedy struck the James Smith Cree Nation and the nearby village of Weldon. On September 14th, 11 people died and 18 others were injured after a mass stabbing took place at the hands of 32-year-old Miles Sanderson. The community banded together to grieve. Daryl Burns' sister Gloria was one of the victims. He embraces the partner of Jamie and Sanderson.
Her husband was one of the accused. Her husband was accused of killing my sister. Our family is here to forgive. This woman shouldn't have to bear that kind of guilt and shame and responsibility.
Her husband, Damian Sanderson, and his brother Miles were the two most wanted men in Canada after the stabbings. But Damian's body was discovered on September 5th, a victim of his brother, according to the RCMP. In late September, Megan Gallagher's remains were found on the banks of the Saskatchewan River near St. Louis, 2 years after her disappearance from Saskatoon. 9 people are facing a bevy of charges, including murder, forcible confinement, and indignity to human remains in connection to her death. Those cases are making their way through the courts. Soon after the James Smith stabbings, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came out to the community with a plan to heal from the attacks.
All members of our communities should have access to the type of support they need. Today, we're taking action to improve access to care for the people of James Smith Cree Nation. We'll invest $40 million over 6 years to build a new wellness centre here in the community and to repurpose the existing Saquatamo Lodge to address immediate needs.
He then pledged another $20 million for safety projects on First Nations across Canada. As part of reconciliation, an Alberta rancher and 2 Christian charities are giving bison back to First Nations people. Tear Fund Canada and the Loco-Koa Samoan Youth Ministry in Saskatchewan donated 24 to the Cody First Nation. The Papikasis and Sagamay First Nation were also gifted the bison. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
A coroner's inquest, healthcare, and the treaty fishery are just some of the major Indigenous stories that made headlines in 2022 in the Atlantic region. APTN's video journalist Angel Moore brings us this year in review.
Indigenous leaders in New Brunswick are calling for an Indigenous-led public inquiry into systemic racism in policing and the justice system.
So it's necessary when justice is not being served to our Indigenous people, to people in general, all New Brunswickers.
The renewed call for the inquiry came following the long-awaited coroner's inquest into the death of Chantal Moore of the Tlaoquiot First Nation in British Columbia. The jurors of the inquest found Moore's death was homicide. Martha Martin, Moore's mother, was overwhelmed.
You hear every detail leading up to the death of your child, and you hear to the very last moment that her breath was taken. It was like having your heart ripped out twice. It was like having your child taken away twice.
Moore, 26 years old, was shot 4 times by Edmundston, New Brunswick Constable Jeremy Sun during a wellness check on June 2020. Sun said Moore approached him with a knife. The 5 jurors' recommendations included more police training. Martin is doubtful.
I say enough is enough. It is time for our government politicians to start doing those actions and stop doing the recommendations, because recommendations, they're clearly not working.
On December 16th, the New Brunswick Commissioner on Systemic Racism released a report with 86 recommendations, including a task force to dismantle systemic racism in policing. But the report did not recommend an Indigenous-led public inquiry. In Unama'ki, also known as Cape Breton, a family says systemic racism contributed to the death of their loved one. Bridget Ann Denny, 65 years old, of the Eskazoni First Nation, unexpectedly died while in care at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital on January 20th, 2021. Mary I. Jo Francis, Denny's daughter-in-law, says,
I question myself all the time. What if there was a non-Native person in there? Would they have, would they have answered the buzzer? Would they have ran? You question this stuff because we're First Nation people. We live with racism every day. And it's in the back of your mind. You just wonder, what if?
Denny's body was cremated, and days before the funeral, the family found out from another patient Denny had fallen in the middle of the night.
But if we had known she had fallen, that all this stuff was wrong with her the night before, we would have wanted an autopsy. The medical examiner wasn't even made aware of her death because it was just kind of like brushed off.
Judy Sark, Denny's friend and fellow patient, describes the night she called for help from her hospital bed.
I kept on pressing that beep, beep, beep sound, and then when I pressed it, nobody came and helped her. And I kept on saying, help! Somebody fell down. I had to because she was my friend.
An investigation by Nova Scotia Health found inadequate care and a lack of documentation by nursing staff. The family is exploring legal action. Systemic racism is inhibiting treaty rights, according to the Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans report released last June, recommending the government address systemic racism in the Department of Fisheries and the RCMP. Senator Dan Christmas didn't mince words.
So the ugly reality of racism in Nova Scotia and elsewhere is quite evident and undeniable. So we strongly recommend that that the government consider doing more public education.
Meanwhile, Mi'kmaq fishermen facing charges for violating the Fisheries Act say they have a constitutional right to harvest lobster to earn a moderate livelihood. Matt Cope of the Millbrook First Nation hopes his treaty rights will prevail.
I was 14 years old when the Donald Marshall Jr. decision was made. It's been 20-something years now. I'm 36 years old. If I keep waiting, I won't get to experience my rights in my lifetime.
James Nevin of the Sabaganagati First Nation says fishery charges are a waste of time.
It sucks, really. It's a shame that we got to do this. But like I said, they're trying to back us into a corner for like the past 30 years, right?
Sherman Cremo of the Eskasoni First Nation remains determined.
We have to fight for our rights. Like everyone's fighting down up in Samuelville, and we have our own fight up down here, and so.
Mike Sutherland, who is non-Indigenous, disagrees with the treaty fishery.
You know, basically, eventually we're going to have nothing here. You know, and these boats aren't even from here. They're from down the lake. So they're taking the food from the other people and make a living at it here. Government's got to get off their arse and start doing something.
Cremo says most people are supportive.
Some won't like us, but the other people, they support us in every possible way, and they're nice people here.
I will follow these stories and more in the coming year. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Jabuktuk, also known as Halifax.
All right, we have to step aside for a short break, but we'll have more highlights from the year that was when we come back. Welcome back to APTN National News. There is no question that British Columbia had quite a year. APTN's Tina House takes us on a look back to some of the biggest stories of 2022.
Hundreds of Indigenous leaders, survivors, and their families traveled to Rome, Italy to discuss the impacts of residential schools in Canada and the dysfunction and chaos that continues to wreak havoc for intergenerational survivors.
I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for all of you and the survivors and intergenerational survivors, and wanting to have our truths brought forward to the highest level of the Catholic Church, to have the encounter with the Holy See, Pope Francis.
And after 4 days of meetings with the Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, the Pope addressed the general audience.
Vorrei dirvi di tutto cuore, sono molto addolorato.
For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry.
Outside the Vatican, drummers and singers reacted to the historic apology.
And to have the Spirit, to entice His Spirit, for Him to feel that emotion, to feel that pain that we had as First Nation people, all the residential people across Turtle Island that have had that trauma in their lives, that we start a journey of healing.
For Marilyn Jensen from the Yukon, the apology was meaningful.
Just thinking about my grandparents and my mom and all of our people, you know, who suffered. They suffered greatly for us to be here, to be alive, for us to be able to sing our songs. So really, you know, for myself, it's like I'm here and we're singing our songs. It's really, you know, such a huge and significant message about our resilience as Indigenous people.
With that apology in Rome, Pope Francis then made good on a promise to come to Canada to once again apologize to residential school survivors.
De la época que finalizaron en el sistema de las escuelas residenciales.
I am here because the first step of my penitential pilgrimage among you is that of again asking forgiveness, of telling you once more that I am deeply sorry.
BC continues to see high rates of deadly overdoses from opioids that contain deadly additives, with 2,000 British Columbians expected to lose their lives by the end of 2022.
The drug toxicity is much more unstable now, with benzodope being a regular mainstay now. It's either like it's a 50-50 crapshoot if you get regular fentanyl, which is deadly, or fentanyl mixed with benzodope. And the Canadian Health Authority just released a standing findings on things that could be done better around here, and they released the stats, and they're not really doing anything.
However, the federal government released $5 million to help find solutions, but with the need for getting into treatment outweighing the number of beds available at treatment facilities, will this be enough to save lives? Another serious issue that doesn't seem to be getting any better is the growing number of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Most recently, the cases of Chelsea Poorman, Natasha Harrison, and Noello Soup, who was only 13 years old when she went missing. All three were honored at a memorial where the body of Natasha Harrison was discovered on this dry-docked boat.
I want to be calling out the Vancouver Police Department, because this is three families here that have not gotten the proper support from the police, have not gotten their cases investigated properly.
But despite the difficult stories we have covered this past year, there have also been some inspiring stories too. The annual Vancouver Indigenous Fashion Week was held that showcased the top Indigenous designers. And for the first time in Canadian history, a swearing-in was held for BC's new Premier on an Indigenous reserve and done with a traditional blanketing ceremony. There's no doubt it's been a very tumultuous year here in BC, but we wanted to take this moment to wish you the very best for the new year. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
All right, it's time for one more break. We'll have one final look back at the year that was when we come back. Welcome back. It was a year of mixed results for the Trudeau government, in Ottawa. They made significant progress on some files, including First Nations child welfare compensation and ending mandatory minimum jail sentences. But there was little to no progress on others, such as reducing the staggering percentage of Indigenous women in prison. And as the year drew to a close, a number of key commitments to Indigenous peoples remain unfulfilled. APTN's Fraser Needham has this year in review from the nation's capital.
May this new year be filled with health, happiness, peace, to continue the good work that is so much needed for First Nations children and families.
2022 began with hope. After decades of legal wrangling, Ottawa signed a major $20 billion agreement in principle with the Assembly of First Nations executive and class action lawyers. It was to compensate First Nations children and their families victimized by a chronically underfunded child welfare system. Indigenous Services Canada Minister Patty Hajdu said it was a lesson learned at a press conference in early January.
I hope the lesson that we're learning, as I said earlier, is that discriminatory funding for Indigenous people in this country is not just harmful and wrong and morally repugnant, but that it is shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of prosperity for the entire country.
The Liberals also put forward another $20 billion to reform the child welfare system itself, but in the end it was not to be so easy. In October, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal said Ottawa's agreement still does not meet the terms of its 2016 landmark ruling, including providing each child and family with a minimum compensation payment of $40,000. And at the AFN Winter Assembly, First Nations leaders passed an emergency resolution calling on the Trudeau government to meet all terms of the CHRT decision. Here's what First Nations Child and Family Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock had to say in December.
Is that these were victims who already were entitled to $40,000 through legal orders, and under the old arrangement they would have seen that go down to zero. Now, thanks to the leadership, that's going to remain at 40, and so that's what the agreement needs to deal with.
In November, the Liberals passed legislation ending mandatory minimum sentences. These types of sentences tend to affect minority groups disproportionately, including Indigenous women, who now make up a staggering 50% of the female prison population. Bill C-5 takes mandatory minimums for most drug and some firearms offenses off the books, but others, such as those for murder, sexual offenses, and impaired driving, remain. And the new legislation left a lot of justice reform advocates, including Senator Kim Pate, disappointed.
The reality is, if mandatory minimum penalties made us safer,
then the United States should be the safest place in the world. And if implementing them is soft on crime, then show us the evidence that jailing more and more Indigenous women and putting more and more of their kids in state care is going to make us safer.
The overall high percentage of Indigenous people in Canadian jails continued to dog the Liberal government in 2022. This in spite of making up only 5% of the Canadian population. Indigenous people make up about 32% of the prison population, and these numbers show no signs of decreasing anytime soon. As a result, Canada's correctional investigator once again blasted the government when he released his annual report in early November.
And for an organization that spends so much money to have poor correctional outcome, especially for Indigenous prisoners as well as for Black prisoners, is a real shame and something that Canadians should be concerned with.
On a more positive note, history was made in August when Michelle O'Bonsawin became the first Indigenous woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada. Here's what the member of the Odanak First Nation in Quebec had to say to parliamentarians.
But at the end of the day, if you work hard and your heart's in it, you could go and do what you want. And I'm hoping that young people, female, Indigenous women also, will see that anything is possible if you set your mind to it.
And we couldn't end the year in review without talking about the Freedom Convoy movement, which literally took over the streets of downtown Ottawa from late January to late February. Semi-trucks, flag-waving protesters, and even the odd bouncy castle were all part of it. APTN News talked to Brendan Nimkus Addison, First Nations heavy truck mechanic from Manitoulin Island. He said he experienced nothing but positive vibes in the anti-vaccine movement and felt it was being misportrayed in the mainstream media.
The other side that I feel that's not being shared is there's a lot of compassion. There's a lot of compassion and support from Canadian citizens all across Canada and even beyond Canada for what's going on here, because it's truly about more than just truckers and being able to have a border mandate removed now.
Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
All right, that's all we have for you this time around on APTN National News. As always, you can visit our website, aptnnews.ca, to catch up on any stories. I'm Daryl Stranger. For all of us here, thank you for joining us. Jimmy Gwitch, have a great night.